reading Blackface, White Noise, Jewish Immigrants, and the Hollywood Melting Pot by Michael P. Rogin, published by University of California Press, 1998. Chapter 1, Uncle Sammy and My Mammy. 1. Quote, Jolson, end quote, the hero of a 1936 Warner Brothers Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies cartoon, is thrown out of his father's house because he wants to sing, quote, jazz, end quote. The father, identified by accent and demeanor as an old world music teacher, had welcomed the hatching of Al's older siblings. Quote, another Caruso, exclamation point, end quote. Quote, another Chrysler, exclamation point, end quote. Quote, another Mendelssohn, exclamation point, end quote. But Al pops out, quote, a crooner, end quote. Quote, stop, end quote, shouts the father as the fledgling burst into song, setting off on his own. The self made American rebel auditions for a radio talent show. Failed contestants drop through a trapdoor whenever the judge bangs his gavel, but Al wins the contest, and with it the approval of his entire family, by singing, quote, with a cheer for Uncle Sammy and another for my mammy. I love to sing, end quote. The animated film titled I Love to Singa is in part an ephemeron from the temporary 1930s decline of the most popular entertainer of the first half of the 20th century. It advertised Al Jolson's effort to revive his fledgling career on radio. It also promoted what would turn out to be another in his series of unsuccessful films, The Singing Kid, which opens and closes with the song cheering for, quote, Uncle Sammy and My Mammy, end quote. Yet, both the cartoon and the failed feature were situated between two of the most widely seen movies of classic Hollywood, The Jazz Singer, 1927, and The Jolson Story, 1946. The paternal stop, exclamation point, at Al's birth quotes the famous word with which the jazz singer's cantor father interrupts the song playing piano for his mother, thus returning the first talking picture to silence, beginning with paternal disapproval and ending with familial embrace. The cartoon bridges the gap between the generational conflict of the 1920s film and the Americanization of the old people as well in the post World War II, post immigration, post genocide Jolson story. I Love to Singa overrides the details of its historical moment. However, in the way it links art to politics, popular culture Americanizes Al Jolson, defeating old world high culture. How, then, does Uncle Sammy employ, quote, my mammy, end quote, in that process? Question mark. The film singer had Jewish origins, like Chrysler, Mendelssohn, and Jolson, and as in attested by the record collections of numerous grandfathers, mine and the protagonist of Clifford Odets Awake and Sing, for instance. The Italian Caruso was also an idol in immigrant Jewish households. The Owl Jolson cartoon subsumed immigrants' popular music, opera, and the jazz singers' cantorial chants. Under a European elite, what took the place of foreign influence in the cartoon, as in the first talking pictures, was the sound of the man known as, quote, the mammy singer, end quote. Quote, Uncle Sammy, end quote, merged the patriotic icon of Uncle Sam with a familiar figure in American Jewish families. I had one, Uncle Sammy, but that hybridization, too ethnic for universal American appeal, was just another sign of Jolson's foundering for an audience in the 1930s. Quote, Uncle Sammy, end quote, was New York provincial. Jolson's act of genius was to gather immigrants, Jews, and other Americans together under Uncle Sammy's banner by invoking a second patriotic icon, appearing in Jewish incarnation in the plot of The Jazz Singer. She is named in the song Jolson sings in blackface to climax and in the film, quote, my mammy, end quote. Quote, the quote, mammy, end quote, of whom we have so often heard, end quote, as NAACP founder Mary White Ovington called the African American mother, nursed the master's child as well as her own. In domestic service in millions of American households, the percentage of black women in paid employment was several times higher than that of whites, and the difference for mothers was even greater. Quote, mammy, end quote, bestowed, quote, her living care, end quote, on other families at the expense of, quote, her own offspring, end quote. Indeed, Ovington attributed the higher infant mortality rate among African Americans to the fact that, quote, mothers who got out to days' work are also unable to nurse their babies, end quote. Even if Ovington's specific interpretation was distorted by progressive maternalism, she understood that, quote, mammy, end quote, nurtured whites, that is, supplied material support and a symbolic imagined community at the expense of blacks. She knew, too, that the mammy of unconditional love was actually a domestic worker, not least in urban Jewish households, that forcing her to compensate for immigrant family rupture effaced the distinctive maternal losses imposed by slavery, and that desexualization was the price the black mother paid for public acceptance. Ovington understood that the condition for displays of interracial intimacy was the color line. Segregation was only half of white supremacy. However, for it coexisted alongside racial cross dressing. A single image inspired the present study. Al Jolson, born Jackie Rabinowitz, Rabinowitz in The Jazz Singer, and reborn as Jack Robin, singing, quote, my mammy, end quote, in blackface to his immigrant Jewish mother. How could blacking up and then wiping off burnt cork be a rite of passage for or from immigrant to American? Question mark. To whose mother is the man born in the world in the old world pale of Jewish settlement really singing? Question mark. Quote, my mammy, end quote, forces us to consider these questions by considering or by condensing into a single figure the structure of white supremacist racial integration that built the United States. Black labor in the realm of production, interracial nurture, and sex, the latter as both a private practice and a unifying public prohibition, in the realm of reproduction, and blackface minstrelsy in the realm of culture. Minstrelsy was the first and most popular form of mass culture in the 19th century United States. Blackface provided the new country with a distinctive national identity in the age of slavery and presided over melting pot culture in the period of mass European immigration. While blackface was hardly the only distinctively American cultural form, even in black white relations, and especially for African Americans, it was a dominant practice and it infected others. My subject, for one cannot study everything, is its place in motion pictures. Minstrelsy claimed to speak for both races through the blackening up of one. Jolson's blackface, quote, my mammy, end quote, in the service of Americanizing immigrants, pretending to the absence of conflict between black and white. After, quote, my mammy, end quote, and a montage of Jolson's other hits opens the singing kid. Jolson cheers for Uncle Sammy and his mammy on one New York rooftop as the black band leader Cab Calloway joins in on another. The separate but equal versus on separate but equal skyscrapers illustrate Jolson's awkward efforts to incorporate actual African Americans into his 1930s films. The trouble arose not from the question of just whose mammy he was singing about, since segregation was already the long established tool of racial harmony. By the 1930s, however, whites in blackface were giving way to African American motion picture actors. What disturbs the films where Jolson performs alongside African Americans is that he continues to appear in the burnt cork that had raised him to stardom. The presence of Jolson among the people he was supposedly representing better than they could represent themselves split into the blackface figure of American unity. No such problem troubled the jazz singer, with Jolson cheering for, quote, my mammy, end quote, and Uncle Sam. Blackface, as American national culture Americanized the son of the immigrant Jew. In his 1914 afterword to The Melting Pot, a play about Jewish Gentile intermarriage that fixed its title on the United States, Israel Zangwill explained, quote, however scrupulous and justifiably America avoids physical intermarriage with the Negro, the comic spirit cannot fail to note the spiritual miscegenation which, while clothing, commercializing, and Christianizing the ex-African, has given, quote, ragtime, end quote, and the sex dances that go to it. First, to white America and thence to the whole white world, end quote. Zangwill was naming the exclusion unthinkingly exposed by Fred Allen in the epigraph to his chapter when he listed, quote, blackface, end quote, and not black performers among the Irish, Jewish, German, and other vaudevillians allowed to perform under the sign of their own ethnicities. Absence in substance, African Americans made their contribution in spirit and, quote, spiritual miscegenation, end quote, between black and Jew not only appealed to mother, it also sacramentalized under burnt cork the earthy miscegenation between Jewish son and his once taboo object of desire. For the jazz singer was marrying outside his community the figure still, quote, scrupulously and justifiably, end quote, forbidden to African American men, the, the all American to distinguish her from mammy, quote, girl, end quote. 2. Jump forward half a century from, quote, Uncle Sammy and my mammy, end quote, in mid-November 1993, perhaps in anticipation of Thanksgiving, both Times and Newsweek published cover stories on the problem of race in the United States. The Time cover, visualizing anxiety over the new immigration, placed photographs of real people of various nationalities, quote, Middle Eastern, Italian, African, Vietnamese, Anglo-Saxon, Chinese, Hispanic, end quote, across the top and down the side of the cover. Women along the X and men along the Y axes of a chromosome linked graph. Computer software known as, quote, morph, end quote, for Metamorphosis 2.0 produced at the meeting points of the graph axes a simulation of the results of extensive intermarriage. Times cover girl, her large image superimposed on the 49 small ones, adding up to the number of states in the Union, represented the all American synthesis. What might seem a bold depiction of miscegenation in the new melting pot was, however, doubly contaminated. For one thing, the pictorialization of distinctive national origins was a throwback to 19th century theories of pure racial types. Just as earlier, quote, scientific, end quote, racism gave precise numerical values to brain size and facial bone structure, so Time produced a, quote, new face of America, end quote, that was, end quote, 15% Anglo-Saxon, 17.5% Middle Eastern, 17.5% African, 7.5% Asian, 35% Southern European, and 6.5% Hispanic. This mathematics this mathematics was doubly imaginary, since the percentages bore no relation to any actual or prospective distribution of nationality groups in the United States. Times foray into computer computer dating might seem to indicate approval of the miscegenation that scientific racism condemned, for the magazine's art directors confessed to falling in love with the cover girl they had created. However, second problem, the price of the attraction was a similar look across all the supposedly different nationalities. In the enlarged living color chart inside the magazine, all 49 faces, even the real people born before computer sex, are rendered in polite pastel shades of light yellow brown. Choosing original pure types of the same, youthful age intensifies the sameness displayed in the name of variety. Not only are the two photographed, quote, Africans, end quote, close in color to the unmorphed Asians, Hispanics, and Anglo Saxons, but their features are Caucasian as well. The timetable not only whitens its Africans, it blots out the two largest racial minorities in the United States by subsuming dark skinned Latinos under, quote, Hispanic, end quote, and including no one labeled African American at all. The intermarriage chart purifies African Americans in words by calling them Africans, as it eliminates the dark majority in images. They would return in the infamous darkening, blackening up of O.J. Simpson's face on the Time cover half a year later. Celebrating the melting pot by whitening its blacks, Time is Time is inadvertently faithful to the historic character of assimilation, since well before the melting pot and the jazz singer, marriages across ethnic and religious lines has symbolized the making of Americans. African Americans were excluded from that process, however, legally as well as symbolically. 24 states forbade white and black intermarriage until the 1967 Supreme Court decision, Loving versus Virginia. The Time cover responds to the changed legal and moral climate by homogenizing all its peoples of color and making the black man and woman virtually invisible. Nevertheless, the repressed returns in the title Time gave to its new melting pot, quote, rebirth of a nation, end quote. The magazine was invoking, without one assumes, full consciousness of its meaning. Hollywood's founding motion picture, Birth of a Nation, where Ku Klux Klan punishment of the black desire for miscegenation marries North to white, off screen, and united immigrants and old stock Americans in the film audience. In quote, rebirth, end quote, in quote, rebirth, end quote, as in birth. Moreover, the inclusion of some people is predicated on the violent exclusion of others, for even after restricting marriage partners by age, color, and aesthetic ideal of facial beauty, Morph still produces monsters, only now in keeping with homophobic demonology. They are sexual instead of racial. Just as Birth invented and then lynched a black rapist beast, so Morph generated and its programmers destroyed a grotesque alter ego of the cover girl, quote, a distinctly feminine face sitting atop a masculine neck and hairy chest, end quote. Times jokey, eugenic inflected elimination of the monstrous birth stands in for the unacknowledged racial cleansing. Newsweek made up for Time's erasure of African Americans by illustrating its contemporaneous cover story, quote, the hidden rage of successful blacks, end quote, with a rarely scroll or scowling African American man half hidden behind a smiling black mask. Newsweek was showing that blacks were still forced to don blackface to minstrelize themselves to ward off white retaliation, and giving voice in the issue to several African Americans, Newsweek advanced well beyond time. One would not know from the Newsweek cover, however, that historically blackface permeated American culture in performances not by blacks but by whites. Even as Time and Newsweek made visible, they also falsely separated miscegenation from racial cross dressing. When these are put back together, the news magazine covers expose what they separately covered over. In the making of American national culture, whites and blackface acted a racially exclusionary melting pot. Newsweek did feature on an inside page a white man under burnt cork, Ted Danson, who had blacked up at a roast for his then companion, the African American movie star Whoopi Goldberg. Danson's quote, blackface thing, end quote, in the words of Carrie Grigsby Bates, his belief that it would be funny to become, quote, a living stereotype that has haunted African Americans for a century, end quote, generated near universal condemnation. Unremarked upon was that Goldberg's stage name was taken from Eddie Cantor's title song, quote, Making Whoopi, end quote, of his Jewish blackface film. Danson and Goldberg, she wrote his lines, mistakenly thought they could get away blacking up to mock, or were they exploiting question mark racial and sexual stereotypes. The actress's reappropriation of blackface, like her interracial romance, may seem like racial progress. So, too, does the movie that cast Danson with Goldberg, Made in America, whose miscegenation theme was forbidden to the screen before the Civil Rights Revolution. Even more up to date was the plot device that brings Whoopi and Ted together in the first place. Whoopi's daughter's apparent discovery that a white man was her mother's anonymous sperm donor. Like other recent movies, Made in America capitalizes on both the continuing friction over interracial sex and the enlistment of romance in the quest for racial harmony. But just as Time's computer daring simulation endorses miscegenation by separating it from sex, so Made in America celebrated interracial sex by cutting it off from reproduction. The movie that seems to be making fun of a mother's belief that black pride requires racial purity ends up by granting her wish. Although the daughter's search for her biological father allows Ted to, quote, make, end quote, her mother, in one meaning of the title, the daughter turns out to be made in America by a black sperm donor after all. Uncle Sam may have moved beyond spiritual miscegenation with the black mother, but he manages to provide the black mother and child with necessary surrogate white father without violating racial descent. Made in America brings up Made in America brings up to date the film tradition, once highly visible and now mostly forgotten, that is the subject of this book. The movie's title is a quadruple entendre, alluding not only to sex, babies, and melting pot patriotism, but also to the product of for sale. Made in America itself racialized entertainment as commodity. Blackface and miscegenation were also selling Time and Newsweek as they had sold mass culture from its American origins. A sales campaign of the 1993 holiday season capitalized similarly on the quote, Made in America, end quote, theme. Quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, end quote, declared a seductive female radio voice. Quote, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. America built a nation around this idea. Leave it to Club Med to build a vacation around it. End quote. Using the American creed to sell vacations may seem like a perversion of the Declaration of Independence. To be sure, Club Med has more politically enlightened, or was to be sure, Club Med was more politically enlightened than the founding fathers. When the ad repeated Jefferson's words a second time, it added, quote, and women, end quote, to, quote, all men, end quote. The female voiceover was promising other women that they, too, could persuade or could pursue happiness and not just occupy the object of pursuit position. Spoken as a female come on, however, the inclusion of women appears a further profanation, sexualizing as the voice commodities the sacred text, but the unspoken in Club Med ad, what is displayed on the Time and Newsweek covers, brings the copy closer to the original. The Declaration of Independence demanded freedom for a nation built on slavery. Club Med promises mostly upscale white American service to be delivered by, in their native habits, mostly third world peoples of color. Instead of dismissing the Club Med ad, let it transport us back to Independence Hall. The racialized foundations of the United States erupt on the surface of the three drafts of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration has now been rendered a visibly hysterical text by the editors of Jefferson's autobiography, in which Jefferson included the Declaration, who used three typefaces to distinguish between the passages of Jefferson's original that remain in the final document, those excised by the convention, and those added to Jefferson's version. Although the entire Declaration shows the marks of multiple authorship, only the section on slavery is made incoherent by their omnipresence. Jefferson himself sought to blame the King of England for inflicting slavery and the slave trade on the colonies, although the Crown's effort to regulate the trade in slaves, sugar, rum, and molasses was actually a cause of the Revolution. But Jefferson's displacement of the crime was too anti slavery for other Southern delegates, and the final version retains only the accusation against George III of inciting slave insurrection. The Declaration of Independence, as its multiple drafts impose, bequeathed a Janus based legacy to the new nation. The logic, as in the Club Med ad, that the equality to which white men were born could be extended to women and slaves, and the foundation of white freedom on black servitude. Slavery's deep embeddedness in the United States produced the Declaration slide from condemning slavery for inflicting bondage to blaming slaves for demanding freedom. And it will come as no surprise that to readers of Time and viewers of Made in America, as the reversal infected Jefferson himself. It took a sexualized turn. Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, appended to his proposal to emancipate slaves, speculations on the natural inferiority of Africans. Because black men desired white women, wrote Jefferson, they could not be freed without, quote, staining the blood, end quote, of their former masters. Although the father of the Declaration favored returning slaves to Africa, his twin policies of segregation, the removal of Indians as well as slaves, worked only in Indian policy. Jefferson's wish to, quote, remove blacks beyond the reach of mixture, end quote, conflicting as it did with the actual white dependence on African Americans, issued forth in a quadruple fantasy: that interracial sex was a barrier to emancipation, that it stained blood, that it was driven by black and not white practices, and that colonization in Africa could solve the problem. Slave owners like Jefferson, including his own father in law and nephew, and likely Jefferson himself, produced children whose condition followed that of their slave mothers, claiming that it was the black desire for white that required the separation of the races. Jefferson inverted a white male desire for black. In his day, that desire took the form of labor and sex, chattel slavery, and miscegenation. As expressive performance in the form of blackface minstrelsy, white's possession of black would help produce a second cultural declaration of independence during the age of Jackson. Nonetheless, there was always a contradiction between the logic of natural rights and white supremacy. Almost from the moment of its inception in the late 19th century, the immigrant Yiddish press began to protest against the denial of equality to African Americans. Quote, "Pogrom in Pennsylvania," end quote, is the headline Alfred Kazin remembers above a 1920s Jewish Daily Forward report of a lynching. Lynchings and race riots, pogroms in the Promised Land, were, in the oft-repeated phrase, quote, a stain of shame on the American flag, end quote, consciously invoking the Declaration of Independence. The phrase unknowingly reproached Jefferson for blaming the, quote, stain, end quote, on victimized black bodies. Many Jews who were entering the melting pot had their own stain of shame, however, burnt cork, for by the turn of the 20th century, Jewish entertainers were the major blackface performers, and their stain in the link between Jefferson's Declaration and blackface Ted Danson's Made in America. Jews in the entertainment business, vaudeville, Tin Pan Alley, Hollywood, were creating mass culture for the immigrant industrial age. In the cultural production of America, Jewish blackface was playing a role. 3. Blackface White Noise investigates the neglected roots of motion pictures, the dominant popular culture form of the first half of the 20th century. In the first and most popular form of 19th century mass culture, blackface minstrelsy. Motion picture blackface, I propose, inherited the function of its predecessor by joining structural domination to cultural desire. It turned Europeans into Americans. Frederick Jackson Frederick Jackson Turner began his classic frontier thesis with the words, quote, "The wilderness strips off the garments of civilization and arrays the colonist in the hunting shirt and moccasin. The outer is a new product that is American," end quote. Like the myth of the West, blackface was a form of racial cross dressing. Current writing on gender, race, and popular culture celebrates the subversive character of cross dressing for allegedly destabilizing fixed identities. Such accounts need to consider history if they are to carry conviction. For far from being the radical practice of marginal groups, cross dressing defined the most popular integrative forms of mass culture. Racial masquerade did promote identity exchange, I argue, but it moved settlers and ethnics into the melting pot by keeping racial groups out. History, not biology, distinguishes ethnicity from race, making the former groups in the American usage distinctive but assimilable. Walling off the latter legally, socially, and ideologically to benefit those within the magic circle and protect the national body from contamination. Although inherent and immutable differences supposedly keep racial groups distinct, the racial label is a shifting one. Anglo Saxonists postulated a racial divide between old immigrants to the United States and groups that are now called white ethnics. During the period of mass European immigration, roughly the 1840s to the 1920s, the racial status of Irish, Italians, Jews, and Slavs was in dispute, as anti Semitism racialized Jews in Europe. However, European immigrants to the United States were coming under the banner of a new racial invention, whiteness. Quote, "No one was white before he or she came to America," end quote, wrote James Baldwin. Quote, "It took generations and a vast amount of coercion before this became a white country. There is an Irish community, there is a German community, there is a Jewish community, there are English communities, there are French communities," end quote, Baldwin explains. Quote, "Jews came here from countries where they were not white, and they came here in part because they were not white. Everyone who got here and paid the price of the ticket, the price was to become, quote, white," end quote. Quote, "The differentiation of white immigrant workers from colored chattel, a process organic to the creation of race-based slavery as the origins of the United States, was repeated for the waves of European immigrants that came to these shores after slavery had come to an end. Minstrelsy and Hollywood were venues for that sorting out procedure. By transubstantiating the forbidden mixture of bodily fluids into a burnt cork covered white face, blacking up mocks any claim of division between the personal and the political. Blackface is grounded in mammy, since the nurturing figure that deprived black men and women of adult authority and sexuality gave white boys permission to play with their identities, to fool around. Instead of assigning Uncle Sam to political iconography, Mammy to a circumscribed domestic space, American national politics and culture, I will argue, issued forth from the quote spiritual miscegenation end quote between the two. Together, they provide white Americans with their imagined community, their national home. This study examines the conjunction between blackface and Americanization, a meeting that hardly exhausts the multiple significance of either term. I will focus neither on Uncle Sam nor on Mammy, though both will often appear in these pages, but rather on the acculturating Jew, but rather on the acculturating Jewish male entertainers and producers who negotiated between them. Those figures appear in some of the films we will be looking at. They are implicated in various ways in others that have no explicit Jewish theme. Visible Jewish absence is significant not because of some invisible Jewish power operating behind the scenes, but rather because of the already racialized culture that immigrant Jews create or in that immigrant Jews entered, which they had no role in originally creating. Part 1 sets the stage. Parts 2 and 3, beginning with Al Jolson's Jazz Singer, examine how Hollywood blackface helped engender white America. The Hollywood version of the American story is necessarily partial. With respect to Jewish blackface, it picks up the tale. It picks up the tale at the end of mass immigration, removing it in both space and time from the polyglot immigrant cosmos of New York's Lower East Side. In ethnography of stage blackface, vaudeville, the sheet music business, and Broadway, or a study of early New York based silent film, would offer a rarer, more variegated picture of Jewish blackface than The View from Hollywood. Nonetheless, the traces of New York, though we cannot take them at face value, are thematized in Jolson's Jazz Singer and Cantor's Whoopee! Exclamation point, both from Broadway plays and both featured in the pages that follow. Those films illustrate Hollywood's reach. No single institution in the first half of the 20th century had more mass cultural importance than the motion picture business. Hollywood's importance in making Americans and giving people from diverse class, ethnic, and geographic origins a common imagined community is, is by now a commonplace. What has not heretofore been noticed is that the four transformative moments in the history of American film, moments that combine box office success, critical recognition of revolutionary significance, formal innovations, and shifts in the cinematic mode of production, all organize themselves around the surplus symbolic value of blacks, the power to make African Americans represent something beside themselves. With Edwin S. Porter's film trilogy of 1902 through 1903 encompassing the West in The Great American Train Robbery, The City in The Life of an American Fireman, and The South in Uncle Tom's Cabin, the history of American movies begins. It begins with race. Porter introduced national narratives and stylistic inventions into the welter of foreign imports, documentary actualities, real and staged, cinematographic tricks, and unmotivated short scenes of comedy and violence that constituted primitive cinema, bringing the most performed theatrical spectacle of the late 19th century, Uncle Tom's Cabin, into the movies marked the transition from popular theater to motion pictures that characterize the prehistory of classic Hollywood. The most lavish and expensive to date, and the first to use intertitles, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was the first extended movie narrative with a black character, and therefore, since African Americans were forbidden to play serious dramatic roles, the first substantial blackface film. Straddling the border between blackface and motion pictures, and undercutting Stowe's novel, Porter's one-reeler introduced the plantation myth into American movies. D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, 1915, originated classic Hollywood cinema in the rise of the Ku Klux Klan against black political and sexual revolution, inadvertently underlying the status of the black menace as white fantasy. Birth's two rapists and its mulatto seductress were whites in blackface. Quote, the longest, costliest, most ambitious, most spectacular American movie to date, end quote. Its technique, expense, length, mass audience, critical reception, and influential historical vision all identify Birth as the single most important movie ever made. Uncle Tom's Cabin, with Porter at the camera, derived from the artisanal mode of film production. Birth confirmed the period of directorial control. The Jazz Singer, 1927, was the founding movie of Hollywood sound, and it introduced the most popular entertainer of his day, the blackface performer Al Jolson, to feature films. The Jazz Singer was a pure product of the studio producer system, a production assembly line that turned out film after film. Alan Crosland directed The Jazz Singer, but Warner Brothers was in charge. Finally, David O. Selznick's Gone with the Wind, 1939, was perhaps the first example of the production unit system, the method of making films that would come to dominate Hollywood, where an entrepreneur assembled the team for a single blockbuster. Gone with the Wind established the future of the Technicolor spectacular by returning to American film origins in the plantation myth. Birth was the most widely seen film of the silent period. The Jazz Singer broke all existing box office records, and Jolson's blackface sequel, The Singing Fool, 1928, became the leading moneymaker of the 1920s. All three were eclipsed by Gone with the Wind, Hollywood's all-time top box office success. Far from playing themselves in Gone with the Wind, black actors and actresses were assigned roles minstrelsy had already defined. American literature critics from D.H. Lawrence to Richard Slatkin have argued established its national identity in the struggle between Indians and whites. American film was born from white depictions of blacks. The white male hero of so much of our classic literature frees himself from paternal, Old South constraints and declares his American independence against Indians, white over black. To apply Winthrop Jordan's formulation, defines these transformative films. The alternative racial roots are not arbitrary, just as the frontier period in American history generated the classic American literature, so American film was born in the industrial age out of the conjunction between Southern defeat in the Civil War, black resubordination, and national integration. The rise of the multi-ethnic industrial metropolis and the emergence of mass entertainment, expropriated from its black roots as the locus of Americanization. On the one hand, however, the frontier myth was hardly confined to the 19th century. It flourished in the industrial age, and its multiple uses made the Western the most popular film genre in the silent period and during much of the history of sound. On the other hand, racialized sectional conflict, urban immigration, and mass culture originated not with Hollywood but nearly a century earlier, and their most important original cultural progeny was minstrelsy. Indeed, whereas the racialized character of mass entertainment appeared on the blackface surface in the decades surrounding the Civil War and later in the Hollywood Western, very few movies organized themselves around the racial subordination of African Americans. Motion pictures normally buried their racial foundations in white over black romances, melodramas, social problem pictures, westerns, and other adventure stories, historical epics, gangster and detective films, comedies. It is rare to find black and white, in the racial sense, at the center of these genre films. But the transformative moment so beneath the marginal everyday African American presence on screen as servants, entertainers, buffoons. When American film takes its great leaps forward, it returns to its buried origins. Then it exposes the cinematic foundations of American freedom in American slavery. The racial revelations of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Birth of a Nation, The Jazz Singer, and Gone with the Wind also point to widely popular but now neglected routine films of classic talking pictures Hollywood. Films like Cantor's Whoopee! 1930, John Ford's Judge Priest 1934, Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland's Babes in Arms 1939, Fred Astaire and Bing Crosby Holiday Inn 1942, Larry Parks Jolson Sings Again 1949, and others that will appear in the following pages. These movies continue and comment on the blackface melting pot tradition, bringing it forward beyond World War II into the early civil rights era. There, as we will see, the blackface tradition infected race relations films like Body and Soul 1947, Pinky 1949, and Home of the Brave 1949 that wanted to repudiate it. Hollywood was descended from 19th century forms of American popular culture, along with vaudeville and Tin Pan Alley. However, it also added something new to American entertainment, the creative presence of immigrant Jews. Jews, Al Jolson, Eddie Cantor, George Jessel, George Burns, Sophie Turner had pretty well taken over blackface by the early 20th century. Jewish songwriters Irving Berlin, George Gershwin, and Jerome Kern, to name only the most famous, pamphlet, quote, Jew Stars Over Hollywood, end quote, charged, quote, the motion picture industry was or has become a Jewish industry run by and for Jews, end quote. Since Gabler is right, one cannot meet such anti Semitic accusations brought up to date by Louis Farrakhan, Leonard Jeffries, and Khalid Abdul Muhammad by burying the Jews' presence in the entertainment business. Just as immigrant Jews were helping to produce a racialized 20th century mass culture in the United States, they also led the fight for civil rights. Unlike adherents of the working class, Irish Democratic Party milieu of blackface, Jewish activists were distinctively allied with African Americans in the struggle for racial equality. Both civil rights and minstrelsy were ways of establishing an American imagined community, making them identities out of the diverse peoples of the old world. Supporters of civil rights invoked the Declaration of Independence, which founded the new nation politically in natural light. The historian of Jewish support for black causes, Hasia Diner, explains that Jews could prove their Americanness by supporting the American creed. Blackface minstrelsy founded the new nation culturally in racial wrong. Jews acquired American credentials by, in this racially divided society, taking control of the blackface role. Civil rights descended from what Lincoln called, quote, the father of all moral principles, end quote, extending to all those not, quote, descended by blood from our ancestors, end quote. The high words of, quote, that old Declaration of Independence, end quote. Blackface staged the return of what the document repressed, slavery, by displaying the racialized body whited out beneath the Declaration's universalist claims. The demand for racial justice extended the melting pot to peoples of color, offering an exclusionary alternative to melting pot blackface. Instead of aspiring upward to a unifying ideal, minstrels dressed down through hierarchical racial division. Civil rights called blackface into question, posing from Wendell Phillips, Frederick Douglass, and Lydia Maria Chiles to W.E.B. Du Bois, Joel Springarm, and Jane Addams to A. Philip Randolph, Rosa Parks, and John Lewis or James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman. The most fundamental, politically significant challenge ever mounted to racial inequality in the United States. It would be seriously mistaken from the position either of misguided sympathy for blackface popular culture or of legitimate disappointment at the shortcomings of civil rights politics to collapse the differences between the two. Such a declaration of political virtue would be fatuous. However, if blackface did not cast its shadow over civil rights as well, for the two forms of Jewish/black identification shared a common world, targets alike of discrimination and racial prejudice. Jews and African Americans formed a political alliance. As the anthropologist France Boas put it in his foreword to Mary White Ovington's quote, refutation of the claim that the Negro has equal opportunity with the whites, and that his failure to advance more rapidly than he has is due to innate inability. End quote. Quote, the Negro of our times carries even more heavily the burden of his racial descent than did the Jew of an earlier period. End quote. Under the conditions of white supremacy in politics and entertainment, though Jews could speak for blacks, but not blacks for Jews. Racial hierarchy placed such pressure on the idea of equality, moreover, that even representations intended to include peoples of color within the Declaration of Independence still often reproduce racialized images. These were images embodying desire, finally, not just repulsion. Blackface and civil rights shared an investment in the other side of the racial divide, although minstrelsy advertised that interest as racial difference, which civil rights presented it as common humanity. The movies will the movies we will look at expose a less clearly divided picture. Michael Romer, a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany who directed Nothing But a Man, 1963, a film about a Southern black family, recently explained, quote, in the 1960s, we felt we could cross these racial lines, that we were all one, and I think we were a bit optimistic, end quote. Equally fascinated with crossing the racial line, blackface and civil rights often cohabitated often cohabited as secret sharers. This commonality was not universal, however. It was less characteristic of the real world civil rights struggle for example, where, in legal challenges and on the streets, African Americans played significant leadership roles, than of Hollywood versions of interracial sympathy, where they did not. Even on the motion picture screen, minstrelsy does not infect Nothing But a Man. As a director and self critic, however, Romer is exceptional. Motion picture blackface, neglected in so many ways, illuminates the prehistory of the current, widely reported troubles between these two historically identified groups, African Americans and Jews. Hollywood blackface once celebrated America, and we should not avert our eyes from its country. The literal meaning of blackface, blackening up to play the African American role, as used here, subsumes two metaphors. One points to white modes of representing blacks that take the form of appropriative identification. The other includes African Americans who, whether or not literally under burnt cork, perform against themselves for white eyes. Although to what extent minstrel roles actually constrain blacks in blackface, particularly in front of African American audiences, is a disputed question. Figurative blackface played a role when African Americans got parts in films and in the modern civil rights period began, and as the modern civil rights period began. But black minstrel roles and civil rights, I will argue, are embedded in the long history of literal blackface, peculiar feature peculiar feature of American. I'll read it back. The view through burnt cork places race relations at the center of mass political and culture in the United States. It displays the peculiar feature of American nationalism, a popular expression that emerged by way of the frontier myth on the one hand, blackface minstrelsy on the other, not to free oppressed folk, but to constitute national identity out of their subjugation. And it opens up the links that have been bound that have bound Jews and African Americans together supportively and problematically in popular culture and liberal politics. And I was reading chapter 1, Uncle Sammy and My Mammy, in Blackface White Noise, Jewish Immigrants in the Hollywood Melting Pot by Michael P. Rogin, published by University of California Press, 1998.